Germany, 1923. A loaf of bread cost 200 billion marks. Families burn their own banknotes in the stove because paper money is cheaper than firewood. Waiters climb onto restaurant tables every half hour just to shout out new prices because the old ones are already worthless. 6 years later, the Great Depression arrives. Banks collapse. Factories shut their doors. By 1933, 6 million Germans stand in unemployment lines. 30% of the entire workforce. This is the broken, bankrupt nation that Adolf Hitler inherits. Yet just 6 years after that, in 1939, everything has changed. German tanks roll across the Polish border. Modern aircraft darken the sky above. A ruined economy has somehow become the most feared war machine in Europe. How does a bankrupt country build all of this in 6 years with no money, no credit, and no one noticing? The answer involves a fake company, a financial genius, and a debt trap built with a 5-year fuse. When that fuse finally burned down in 1939, Germany was left with only 2 choices: pay a debt it could never afford, or invade its neighbors to make the bill disappear forever. This is the true story of how a broken nation financed the deadliest war in human history, and why the man who built the scheme knew from the very beginning exactly how it would end. I'm glad you're here today. What state are you watching from? Berlin? November 1923. A woman stands in a bakery line that stretches around the block. She has been waiting since dawn, clutching a wicker basket, not for bread, but for cash. Behind the counter, a clerk changes the chalkboard price for the 3rd time that morning. When she finally reaches the front, a single loaf costs 200 billion marks. She does not blink. She has stopped being shocked by numbers that no longer mean anything. Across the city, a factory worker is paid twice in one day, once at noon and once at closing time, because by evening his morning wages will not buy a single potato. He runs, not walks, from the paymaster's window to the market, because every hour the money sits in his pocket, it loses value. In restaurants, waiters climb onto tables every 30 minutes to shout out new prices to customers who are still chewing their food. A soup that costs 10,000 marks at breakfast might cost 11,000 by dinner. This is not simply inflation. This is the destruction of an entire nation's sense of reality. Families who spent decades feeding coins into life insurance policies, sacrificing small comforts for future security, discover that their matured policies are now worth less than a postage stamp. A lifetime of discipline reduced to worthless paper. Some families, in a final act of practical despair, burn stacks of banknotes in their stoves because at this point, cash is genuinely cheaper than firewood. The middle class, the school teachers, the retired officers, the widows living on pensions, watch their entire life savings evaporate in a matter of weeks. Children collect worthless banknotes and stack them into towers taller than their own heads. A strange, sad game born from catastrophe. Elderly couples who once prided themselves on frugality now stand outside shuttered banks, staring at notices they cannot quite believe, wondering how the discipline of an entire lifetime could be erased in a single season. Newspapers print cartoons of shoppers pushing wheelbarrows stacked with cash just to buy a sack of flour. And the cruelest part is that the cartoons are barely an exaggeration. In some towns, workers demand payment in kind rather than currency, trading their labor directly for potatoes, kual, or a length of fabric, because at least those things hold their value from one day to the next. Trust, the invisible thread that holds any economy together, has been severed completely. And trust once broken this badly, does not repair itself quickly, Germany slowly claws its way back from the abyss. A new currency is introduced, stabilized, trusted again. For a few short years, something like normal life returns. Then, in October of 1929, an ocean away, the American stock market collapses, and the shock wave crosses the Atlantic with brutal speed. American banks, desperate for liquidity, recall the short-term loans that had been quietly propping up German industry for years. German businesses, dependent on that foreign credit, begin to fail, one after another. By 1932, 6 million Germans are unemployed. 30% of the entire workforce stands idle. In cities like Berlin and Hamburg, families sell their furniture on the sidewalk, piece by piece, just to buy enough food for another week. Engineers who once designed bridges now beg for work, digging ditches. Trained teachers stand in soup kitchen lines beside dock workers and clerks. The distinction between educated and uneducated, skilled and unskilled, dissolves in the face of universal desperation. Outside factory gates that no longer open, men gather anyway out of habit, standing in silence, as if their presence alone might summon work back into existence. Soup kitchens run by churches and charities stretch their broth thinner each week, and the line for a bowl grows longer every morning before the sun even rises. Fathers who once brought home a steady wage now sit at kitchen tables long after dark, staring at unpaid bills, unable to look their children in the eye. In working-class districts, entire blocks of apartments stand half empty. Families evicted for rent they simply do not have. The despair is not abstract. It lives on every street corner, in every empty shop window, in every child sent to school without breakfast. The Weimar government, fractured and indecisive, seems paralyzed. In the streets, communist paramilitaries and Nazi brown shirts fight pitched battles with fists, clubs, and occasionally guns, turning entire neighborhoods into war zones. Twice within 14 years, the German economy has been utterly destroyed. Twice. Ordinary families have watched their security vanish overnight. It is into this wreckage, this exhausted and humiliated nation, that a new chancellor is sworn in on the 30th of January, 1933. Adolf Hitler takes power. He promises what desperate people always want to hear: restored greatness, full employment, defiance against the humiliating terms imposed on Germany after the last war. But promises alone do not build armies, and Germany's hands are tied in ways that go far beyond empty treasuries. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in the aftermath of Germany's defeat, restricts the nation to a military of no more than 100,000 soldiers. No tanks are permitted, no military aircraft, no submarines, no heavy artillery beyond token defensive pieces. On paper, Germany is barely allowed to defend its own borders, let alone project power across a continent. And even if those restrictions vanished overnight, Germany still has no money. The treasury is empty. The nation has been bankrupted twice inside a single generation. Hitler needs to rearm on a massive scale. He needs to do it in secret, because international observers are watching for any sign of German remilitarization, ready to intervene the moment they see it. And he needs to accomplish all of this using an economy that has already collapsed twice and cannot survive a third round of runaway inflation. It is an almost impossible set of constraints, yet one man believes he has found a way through. His name is Hjalmar Horace Greeley Schacht. Born in 1877, a banker and economist already regarded as something close to a national hero. In 1923, at the very height of the hyperinflation crisis, Schacht had been appointed currency commissioner He engineered a new currency, backed not by gold, but by mortgaged land and industrial assets. And against nearly everyone's expectations, it worked. The new currency stabilized, prices stopped spiraling. Ordinary Germans could trust money again for the first time in years. Schacht became a legend almost overnight. The man who tamed hyperinflation with nothing but clever paperwork and public confidence. On the 17th of March, 1933, Hitler appoints Schacht as president of the Reichsbank, Germany's central bank. A year and a half later, in August of 1934, Schacht is elevated further, becoming Minister of Economics as well. His unofficial assignment is staggering in its ambition: fund a total rearmament of the German military without triggering the kind of inflation that destroyed the middle class a decade earlier, and without letting foreign governments see what Germany is actually spending. Schacht is not an ideologue. He is not, by temperament, a devoted follower of Hitler's racial theories or his talk of a 1,000-year empire. He is, above all else, a technician, a man who takes pride in solving problems that other men consider impossible. Colleagues describe him as cold, précis, almost arrogant in his certainty that he alone understands how modern finance truly works. That certainty, that same stubborn confidence, which once rescued Germany from hyperinflation, is exactly what makes him valuable to a regime that needs an economic miracle on an impossible deadline. He accepts the assignment not entirely out of loyalty to Hitler, but out of the sheer intellectual challenge it represents, a puzzle only a mind like his could hope to solve. Consider the mechanics of the problem Schacht now faces. Germany needs to build tanks, aircraft, warships, artillery, and small arms by the millions. That means paying steel producers, chemical manufacturers, engineering firms, and arms makers vast sums of money. If the Reichsbank simply prints new currency to cover these payments, two catastrophic outcomes follow almost immediately. First, inflation returns with a vengeance, and the German public, having lived through the horror of money that lost its value between morning and night, will not tolerate it a second time. Political stability could collapse within months. Second, and just as dangerous, any large payments flowing openly through the Reichsbank's official books will show up on financial statements that foreign governments and international bankers routinely examine. British and French observers are actively watching German industrial output, German steel consumption, German factory expansion, looking for the telltale signs of illegal rearmament. Visible spending on this scale would expose the entire project long before Germany is ready to act on it. Hitler does not simply need money. He needs invisible money, spending that funds an army, but leaves no fingerprints on any government ledger. Schacht, drawing on the same inventive instincts that ended the hyperinflation crisis a decade earlier, designs an answer. In 1934, he creates a company. Its Name ist Metallurgische Forschungsgesellschaft, shortened simply to MEFO, which translates roughly to Metallurgical Research Company. On paper, this is a modest research consortium jointly owned by four of Germany's largest industrial names: Siemens, Krupp, Rheinmetall, and Gute Hoffnungshütte. Its official capitalization is a mere 1 million Reichsmarks, a trivial sum by the standards of national rearmament. In reality, MEFO manufactures nothing. It researches nothing. It has no factory floor, no laboratory, no employees turning out actual products. It exists almost entirely as a name on a letterhead and a single bank account. A hollow shell built for one purpose only. Visitors who might go looking for its offices would find little more than a modest room. a filing cabinet, and a handful of clerks whose only real job is signing paper, and this quiet, empty little company, invisible to the outside world, is about to become the financial engine behind the largest rearmament program history has ever seen. Somewhere in a modest Berlin office, a stack of blank promissory notes waits to be signed, notes that will soon fund a war machine capable of conquering an entire continent, while the rest of the world remains almost completely unaware of what has happened. To understand exactly how a hollow shell company could fund an entire war machine, you have to follow the money through every step of its invisible journey. Imagine for a moment that you are a German arms manufacturer in 1935. Your factory floor hums with new orders. The government has just asked you to produce 1,000 tanks. This should be the greatest contract of your career. But when payment arrives, it does not come in ordinary Reichsmarks. It comes in something called a MEFO bill. These bills are, in essence, promissory notes, pieces of paper on which the shell company MEFO promises to pay the stated amount in full 5 years from the date of issue. They carry a modest 4% interest rate and can be renewed every 3 months if needed. On the surface, this looks like a strange, almost insulting way to pay a supplier. You have delivered real tanks, built from real steel, assembled by real workers who need real wages tonight. Not in 5 years. You cannot pay your employees with a promise. You cannot buy raw steel with paper that matures half a decade from now. A single order of 1,000 tanks represents thousands of tons of steel, rubber, and precision machine parts, hundreds of workers laboring across multiple shifts, and an enormous outlay of operating capital that any ordinary company would need to recover almost immediately just to keep its doors open. Under normal peacetime conditions, a contract this size would be negotiated for months, priced with immense caution, and paid according to strict schedules tied directly to delivery milestones under the pressure of Hitler's rearmament timetable. None of that caution survives. Orders arrive faster than factories can reasonably fill them, and payment arrives in a form no accountant trained under the old rules would ever have recommended accepting. So you take your stack of MEFO bills to a private German bank. The bankers examine the paper carefully. They know something the general public does not yet fully grasp. That MEFO, despite its unremarkable name and its tiny official capital, carries the implicit backing of the Reichsbank itself. These bills will be honored. The private bank, confident in that unspoken guarantee, hands you real cash. Actual Reichsmarks, perhaps at a small discount for the weight, but cash. Nonetheless, you pay your workers, you buy more steel, production continues without interruption. As far as you can tell, the system works perfectly. The bank clerk who stamps your bills barely glances up from his desk. To him, this is routine paperwork. One more stack of promissory notes in a drawer, already full of them. He does not ask why a research company with no laboratory and no scientists is suddenly issuing more paper than half the industrial firms in the Ruhr Valley combined. He does not ask, because questions like that are not encouraged, and because the interest payments arrive reliably every quarter, which is, in the narrow world of daily banking, the only proof that matters. Confidence, once established, spreads quietly from one institution to the next. And nobody along the chain feels compelled to look too closely at the foundation, holding it all together. Here is where the true machinery reveals itself. The private bank does not simply sit on these MEFO bills until they mature. Instead, it carries them to the Reichsbank and rediscounts them, exchanging the paper, promises for fresh currency, using the central bank's own money, creating authority. And this is the critical detail that makes the entire scheme function. These transactions never appear on the Reichsbank's official published balance sheet. MEFO bills are technically private obligations, debts owed by a private research consortium, not by the German government and not by the Reichsbank itself. When British and French financial analysts examine Germany's public account, searching for the telltale signs of a nation secretly rearming on a massive scale, they see nothing unusual. The spending is real. The tanks are real. The debt is real. But on paper, officially, none of it exists. Between 1934 and 1938, Germany issues 12 billion Reichsmarks worth of these MEFO bills. To grasp the scale of that number, consider that Germany's entire national debt in 1932, at the absolute depth of the Great Depression, stood at only about 10 billion Reichsmarks. In secret, using a shell company that produces nothing at all, Germany adds more hidden debt than its entire visible national debt combined. And virtually no one outside the country understands the true scope of what is happening until it is far too late to stop it. By 1938, Germany's officially acknowledged national debt has climbed to roughly 19 billion Reichsmarks on its own, a figure already troubling enough to attract cautious commentary from foreign economists. Add the 12 billion Reichsmarks hidden inside MEFO, and the true scale of German government obligation is more than 60% higher than anything appearing in any published statistic. This is the essential trick at the heart of Schacht's design. Not that the debt does not exist, but that it exists in a form nobody watching from outside the country is positioned to see or measure. By 1936, the transformation is staggering. Germany has, in practical terms, violated every single military restriction imposed by the Treaty of Versailles. Tank divisions train in the countryside. New aircraft roll off assembly lines by the hundreds. Submarines slip beneath the waves of the Baltic Sea. A modern, mechanized army has risen from what was only 3 years earlier a bankrupt shell of a nation limited to 100,000 men. The Allied powers, Britain and France, do not intervene, not because they approve, but because the full scale of German rearmament remains hidden behind Schacht's invisible financial architecture. By the time foreign observers begin to grasp the true size of the German military, the moment for easy intervention has already slipped away. British financial attaches stationed in Berlin file reports back to London, noting German industrial output rising sharply, steel consumption climbing month after month. Yet the Reichsbank's published figures show nothing resembling the debt load such expansion should require. Some analysts suspect something is wrong with the numbers. Few of them can say exactly what. Without access to the private ledgers of German industrial firms, without visibility into the quiet exchange of paper between arms manufacturers and private banks, the true mechanism stays hidden in plain sight, disguised as ordinary commercial activity between private German companies who happen to trade heavily with one another. Diplomatic cables from this period reveal genuine confusion mixed with reluctant admiration, a grudging sense that whatever Germany is doing to finance this buildup, it is being done with remarkable sophistication, but every promissory note carries within it the seed of a deadline, and deadlines, unlike political promises, cannot be negotiated away with speeches. The first MEFO bills, issued in 1934, come due 5 years later, in 1939, and when Schacht and his colleagues at the Reichsbank examine the numbers honestly, the conclusion is unavoidable. Germany does not have 12 billion Reichsmarks sitting anywhere to redeem these obligations. The clock, which had been ticking quietly in the background for half a decade, is now running out of time entirely. This is the point where the comparison to a pyramid scheme becomes not just colorful language, but a precise economic description. A classic pyramid or Ponzi scheme functions on a simple principle. Early participants are paid attractive returns using money contributed by new participants, not from any genuine underlying profit. The scheme survives only as long as fresh money keeps flowing in from somewhere. The moment new contributions slow down, the entire structure collapses, and everyone still holding a position loses everything at once. Historians studying the period have made this same comparison repeatedly, noting that the structural logic of MEFO financing mirrors financial fraud almost exactly, with one chilling difference. In an ordinary pyramid scheme, the eventual collapse mainly harms the investors who trusted it. In Nazi Germany's version, the eventual collapse threatens to harm an entire nation, and the men running the scheme hold the power to delay that collapse, not through new investors, but through armies. Nazi Germany's rearmament financing operates on exactly this logic. MEFO bills are promises to pay later, based on the assumption that future economic growth, fueled by the very rearmament they finance, will eventually generate enough revenue to cover them. But by 1938, it becomes painfully clear that ordinary economic growth inside Germany's own borders cannot possibly produce 12 billion Reichsmarks in new revenue fast enough. The scheme requires an infusion of new money from somewhere outside the existing system, and there is only one place left to find money on that scale. Take it from someone else. The four industrial giants who lent their names to MEFO, Siemens, Krupp, Rheinmetall, and Gute Hoffnungshütte, understand this dynamic better than almost anyone outside the Reichsbank itself. Their own factories are the ones receiving these bills as payment in the first place. Executives at these companies quietly calculate, year after year, exactly how much unredeemed paper is accumulating in their own account, IOUs from a shell company that exists only on their own letterhead consortium agreement. They continue accepting the bills anyway, partly because refusing government contracts under this regime carries obvious risks, and partly because they too have convinced themselves, or perhaps simply hoped, that the state backing behind MEFO will hold indefinitely. Their confidence, like the confidence of the private bankers rediscounting the same paper, rests less on solid accounting and more on the assumption that a government determined to rearm will always find some way to make good on its promises, one way or another. Hjalmar Schacht sees this collision coming years in advance. As early as 1937, he begins warning Hitler directly that the economy is overheating dangerously, that military spending has grown far beyond what any peacetime economy can sustain, that continuing on the current path leads only toward collapse. Hitler, consumed by his own timetable of conquest, largely ignores these warnings. Schacht persists anyway, because he understands the mathematics better than almost anyone else alive in Germany at that moment. And mathematics, unlike ideology, does not bend to force of will. In private meetings, Schacht reportedly grows increasingly blunt, laying out columns of figures on his desk and tracing his finger along projections that show the exact month the system runs dry of borrowed time. He speaks the language of balance sheets to a leadership that increasingly speaks only the language of conquest. And the gap between those two languages widens every month. Colleagues who sit in on these meetings later describe an atmosphere of quiet dread, the sense of watching a highly capable man try to reason with forces that have already decided reason is no longer useful to them. Schacht is not opposing rearmament itself. He built the very machine that made it possible. What he opposes is the refusal to acknowledge that the machine has limits and that those limits are now only months away. On the 7th of January, 1939, With the first MEFO bills only weeks from maturity, Schacht and the other directors of the Reichsbank submit a desperate formal memorandum. The document is blunt in a way that few internal Nazi communications dare to be. It urges drastic curtailment of rearmament spending. It calls for a sharply reduced budget. It insists that a balanced fiscal policy is the only remaining method of preventing a second catastrophic bout of inflation, the very disaster Schacht had spent his entire career trying to prevent from ever happening again. It is, in every practical sense, a warning that the machine Schacht himself built is now on the verge of destroying the nation. It was designed to save, delivered in the careful, restrained language of central bankers rather than the alarmed language the moment actually calls for. Hitler's answer comes swiftly and without ambiguity on the 20th of January, 1939. Barely 2 weeks after receiving that memorandum, Hitler dismisses Schacht from his post as president of the Reichsbank, the man who built the invisible financial machine, who engineered the very mechanism that made rapid rearmament possible in the first place, is cast aside the moment he tells the truth about where that mechanism is leading. Schacht had constructed something brilliant, and in doing so, he had also built a time bomb, one he could see ticking clearly even as the men around him refused to look at the clock. Schacht leaves his office at the Reichsbank quietly, without public protest, aware that open defiance against Hitler in early 1939 carries consequences far more severe than the loss of a title. He retains a largely ceremonial position within the government for a time, stripped of any real authority over the machine he built, forced to watch from the sidelines as the very crisis he predicted unfolds exactly as he warned it would. Colleagues who remain in contact with him later describe a man who feels simultaneously vindicated and powerless, proven right by events he no longer has any ability to influence, a strange and bitter kind of victory that brings him no satisfaction whatsoever. It is a peculiar kind of punishment. To build the engine of a nation's ambition, warn correctly about its inevitable failure, and then be forced to watch that failure arrive precisely on schedule from the outside looking in, powerless to alter a single gear of the machine he once controlled completely. With Schacht removed and honest warnings silenced, Hitler faces the same underlying problem, just without the one advisor willing to speak plainly about it. The MEFO bills are still coming due. The debt is still real. The only path forward, in Hitler's view, is not to shrink the war machine, but to feed it with fresh resources seized from beyond Germany's own borders. If the economy cannot generate enough wealth internally, then new wealth must be found externally, by force if necessary. The pattern begins in March of 1938 with the annexation of Austria, an event the Nazis call the Anschluss. Austria is not simply absorbed for reasons of ideology and shared language. Austria possesses real, tangible assets that Germany desperately needs: gold reserves held by the Austrian National Bank, stores of foreign currency, and a functioning industrial base. German forces and administrators move quickly to seize these assets, funneling Austrian gold directly into Reichsbank vaults that had, until recently, been running dangerously thin. Within days of German troops crossing the border, financial officials arrived close behind the soldiers, moving through the vaults of the Austrian National Bank with inventory lists already prepared in advance. Crates of gold bars are loaded onto trains bound for Berlin under armed guard. A transfer conducted with the same cold efficiency as a routine military supply run. Ordinary Austrians wake up to find their nation's savings quietly rerouted north, absorbed into a financial system most of them will never fully understand, For the Reichsbank accountants who had spent the previous year watching MEFO obligations pile up with no clear source of repayment, the sudden arrival of Austrian gold feels, for a brief moment, like the exhale after holding one's breath too long. It is not a solution, it is a reprieve, and everyone with access to the real numbers knows the difference. 6 months later, in September of 1938, comes the Munich Agreement, in which Britain and France, desperate to avoid another general war, permit Germany to annex the Sudetenland, the heavily fortified border region of Czechoslovakia. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain returns home from the negotiations declaring that he believes it is peace for our time, waving a signed paper in front of cheering crowds who desperately want to believe him. Inside Germany, the reaction among those who understand the true financial pressures is far less celebratory and far more calculating beyond the strategic value of that territory. Germany once again gains access to valuable industrial infrastructure and resources that help, however temporarily, to ease the mounting financial pressure. Factories and rail links that once served Czechoslovak defense now feed directly into German supply chains, absorbed with barely a pause in production, while the promises made at that same negotiating table are already quietly being treated inside Berlin as a formality to be discarded the moment it becomes convenient. Then, in March of 1939, only weeks after Schacht's dismissal, Germany occupies the remainder of Czechoslovakia outright, ignoring even the limited promises made at Munich. This time, the prize is extraordinary. Czechoslovakia is home to the Skada Works, one of the most advanced and productive arms manufacturing complexes anywhere in Europe, alongside substantial gold reserves held by the Czechoslovak National Bank. German administrators absorb both almost immediately, converting Skoda's formidable industrial capacity directly into the German war effort, and adding yet another infusion of hard currency into a system still desperately short of real, spendable wealth. Skoda's factory floors, once producing artillery and locomotives under Czechoslovak ownership, do not pause for even a single production cycle. German officers simply replace the leadership, keep the machinery running, and redirect the output toward the Wehrmacht's growing arsenal, skilled Czech engineers, many of whom spent years designing some of the finest artillery pieces in Europe, now find themselves working under German supervision, their expertise absorbed into the very war machine that annexed their homeland. The gold reserves prove equally valuable, transferred with the same practiced efficiency that moved Austria's bullion north a year earlier, this time reportedly including gold that Czechoslovak officials had attempted, unsuccessfully, to move beyond German reach in the final chaotic days before the occupation began. Each conquest solves the immediate crisis, buys a little more time against the maturing debt, and quiets the alarm bells ringing inside the Reichsbank for another few months. But each solution is temporary by its very nature. Conquered gold reserves are finite, seized industrial capacity. Once absorbed, does not multiply on its own. A vault can be emptied only once, and a factory, however productive, still requires raw materials, fuel, and labor that Germany itself does not possess in sufficient quantity. The underlying structural problem, an economy built on debt that requires perpetual external infusions of wealth simply to avoid collapsing under its own weight, remains completely unresolved. Germany has not fixed the machine. Schacht warned about it has only found new fuel to keep feeding it, one conquest at a time, each one slightly larger than the last, because each new debt obligation grows heavier than the one it replaces. By the summer of 1939, the men still running German economic policy understand even if they rarely say it aloud in front of Hitler, that Austria, the Sudetenland, and Czechoslovakia together have only postponed the reckoning, not prevented it. Every ledger they consult, every private conversation held behind closed doors at the Reichsbank points toward the same uncomfortable conclusion that the nation is now trapped inside a cycle it cannot escape through ordinary means. The MEFO bills, the 12 billion Reichsmarks in hidden debt that started this entire chain of conquest, still loom over the nation's finances. Each new territory has bought a few more months of breathing room, but the underlying arithmetic never actually improves, because the war machine itself keeps growing hungrier with every passing year, consuming resources faster than any single conquest can replace them, and there is no more territory left to absorb quietly through diplomacy and intimidation alone. Poland, the next logical target on the map, will not be handed over through another Munich-style agreement. British and French guarantees to Poland make that much clear. Taking it will require war, real war, on a scale Europe has not seen in 2 decades. Inside the Reichsbank, officials who once celebrated the arrival of Austrian gold now quietly calculate how much longer even a successful campaign against Poland could realistically delay the inevitable reckoning, and few of them like the answer they arrive at. The machine built to hide Germany's poverty from the world has, in the space of 5 short years, become a machine that can only be fed by invasion, and by the late summer of 1939, Adolf Hitler is no longer looking for another peaceful annexation. He is looking for an excuse to attack, and the financial architecture built by the very man he fired now leaves him with no other viable path forward. On the 1st of September, 1939, German forces cross into Poland. Close to 2 million soldiers advance behind roughly 3,000 tanks, supported by thousands of modern aircraft filling the sky above towns that have no real defense against them. To the outside world, this looks like naked aggression, ideology made manifest, a dictator seizing territory simply because he believes his people deserve to rule it. And ideology is certainly part of the story, but underneath the propaganda and the speeches about living space and national destiny lies a colder, simpler truth. Germany invades Poland because the alternative is watching its own financial system collapse from within. Poland offers exactly what the crumbling MEFO system still needs: agricultural land capable of feeding a hungry population, coal and other raw materials to keep factories running, and most brutally, millions of people who can be forced into labor for a war machine that no longer has the money to pay free workers what their labor is actually worth. The invasion is not simply a military campaign. It is, in the coldest possible sense, an extraction operation designed to strip a nation of everything valuable enough to keep a bankrupt regime solvent for a little while longer. Within weeks of the invasion, German administrators fan out across Polish territory, conducting the same kind of methodical inventory once performed in Austria and Czechoslovakia, cataloging grain stores, industrial equipment, livestock, and mineral deposits with the cold thoroughness of accountants rather than soldiers. Farms are stripped of their harvests. Rail lines are repurposed to move goods westward into Germany rather than serving the Polish population that built them. For families in Warsaw and the surrounding countryside, the occupation does not simply mean a change of flag flying over government buildings. It means watching the food that should feed their own children loaded onto trains bound for a country that invaded them only weeks earlier. This pattern repeats and intensifies as German conquest spreads across the continent. When German forces occupy France in the summer of 1940, the new arrangement imposed on the French state includes a staggering daily occupation payment, roughly 400 million francs every single day, a sum so enormous that even German administrators occasionally struggle to spend it fast enough. France, in effect, is forced to finance its own occupation, funding the very army that holds its cities under guard. Later in the Soviet Union, German planners draw up detailed schemes to extract grain from Ukraine, oil from the Caucasus region, and raw minerals from occupied territory, treating conquered land not as territory to govern, but as a resource to be drained. Alongside this systematic plunder runs an even darker source of labor: concentration camp prisoners, prisoners of war, and forced laborers rounded up across occupied Europe are put to work inside German industry, manufacturing weapons, assembling machine parts, mining the coal that keeps furnaces burning. Major German companies, names that still exist in some form today, including IG Farben, Siemens, and Krupp, make direct use of this forced and slave labor inside their wartime factories. Prisoners are worked past the point of exhaustion, and when they die from starvation, disease, or simple brutality, they are replaced without hesitation, as though human beings were just another raw material to be consumed and restocked. The Nazi war economy is not merely funded by theft at this point. It is structurally built on human bondage, a fact that makes the entire financial story inseparable from the story of genocide itself. There is no way to separate the balance sheets of these companies from the suffering that produced their wartime profits. Factory ledgers from this period record labor costs that amount to little more than starvation rations. A handful of calories in exchange for a full day's brutal work beside machinery that offers no safety protections and no mercy for the exhausted. Behind every tank that rolls off a German assembly line in the war's later years sits a hidden roster of names. Prisoners whose forced labor never appears as a line item anyone intended future generations to examine closely. This is the final, darkest layer beneath the financial scheme that started with a shell company and a stack of promissory notes. Even the property of Jewish families across Germany and the occupied territories is folded directly into this same extraction machine. Businesses built over generations are seized and handed to party loyalists at a fraction of their value. Bank accounts are frozen and confiscated. Homes are emptied of furniture, artwork, and family heirlooms, all of it sold or redistributed to fund a regime that treats an entire population as one more resource to be liquidated. This is not a side effect of Nazi persecution. It is a deliberated, calculated revenue stream woven into the same financial logic that created MEFO bills and seized Austrian gold. A smaller, almost darkly ironic episode illustrates just how far this system of extraction reaches into ordinary German life. Beginning in the late 1930s, German workers are offered the chance to own the Volkswagen, literally translated as the people's car. Through a savings program run by the Nazi labor organization, workers pay a set amount every week into a savings booklet filled with stamps. Told that once the booklet is full, their car will be delivered. Hundreds of thousands of ordinary German families sign up, dutifully contributing hundreds of millions of Reichsmarks over several years, sacrificing small comforts today for the promise of a car tomorrow. Not one single civilian Volkswagen is ever delivered to a saver throughout the entire Nazi era. The factory built to produce the people's car is converted instead to military production, churning out the Kubelwagen, a rugged military vehicle bearing no resemblance to what those families were promised. The regime that stole gold from Austria and factories from Czechoslovakia also, without any apparent hesitation, quietly picked the pockets of its own most loyal citizens. By this point, a pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Every layer of the Nazi economy, the hidden MEFO debt, The conquered gold reserves, the occupation payments extracted from defeated nations, the slave labor inside armaments factories, the confiscated property of Jewish families stripped of businesses and homes. Even the savings of ordinary German workers exists to solve the same underlying problem again and again, a war machine that consumes far more wealth than it produces, and that can only keep, as long as German forces keep winning, keep advancing, keep conquering new territory. This system continues to function, however brutally. Loot taken from Poland helps fund operations against France. Resources extracted from France help fund preparations for the invasion of the Soviet Union. Each new campaign is not simply a strategic decision on a map, it is also, quietly, a financial necessity, a fresh injection of wealth into a system that has never once, since 1934, actually balanced its own books through ordinary economic activity. The turning point arrives around 1943 and 1944, when German forces begin losing ground on every front rather than gaining it. Retreat means the opposite of conquest. Territory once occupied and drained of resources is abandoned rather than exploited further. The flow of stolen gold, seized factories, and forced labor slows and then reverses entirely, as Germany finds itself defending its own shrinking borders rather than expanding them. Without new territory to extract from the entire financial structure that Hjalmar Schacht first built a decade earlier, and that Hitler kept feeding through conquest after conquest, finally runs out of fuel completely. The war does not merely end in military defeat, it ends in the total collapse of the economic system that made the war possible in the first place. As for Hjalmar Schacht himself, his story takes one final, deeply uncomfortable turn. Arrested after the war's end, he stands trial before the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, accused alongside other senior Nazi officials of crimes connected to the regime he helped finance, yet in 1946, the tribunal acquit him, concluding that his role, however central to funding rearmament, did not rise to the level of the specific charges brought against the major war criminals standing trial beside him. The man who built the invisible machinery that financed Hitler's war walks free, while millions of victims of that same war never receive any justice at all. It remains one of the most debated verdicts to come out of the entire Nuremberg process, a stark reminder that financial genius and moral responsibility do not always end up weighed on the same scale in a court of law. Schacht would go on to live for decades after the trial, long enough to write his own memoirs defending his choices, long enough to watch the nation he once tried to save to rebuild itself from the very ashes his own invisible machine had helped create. So how did Hitler actually pay for World War II? In the end, the honest, uncomfortable answer is that he never truly did. Not in any real or lasting sense. He borrowed, he stole, he enslaved, and he conquered, building a war machine on promises that were never fully honored and debts that were never fully repaid. The Nazi economy was not a triumph of national strength. Whatever the propaganda claimed at the time, it was a carefully engineered illusion, brilliant in its construction, monstrous in its consequences, and destined from nearly the very beginning to collapse the moment it stopped consuming its neighbors. Here's the question worth sitting with. Knowing that this economic system required constant conquest simply to survive, was the Second World War truly inevitable the moment Schacht signed the first MEFO bill in 1934? Or was there ever a point along the way where a different choice, a genuine pullback toward a sustainable peacetime economy, might still have been possible? Share your own view in the comments below. And if this changed the way you understand the true machinery behind Nazi Germany's rise, consider subscribing for more stories that connect history, economics, and the hard choices ordinary people faced when the walls finally closed in around them.